Good evening. Welcome to the West Shore Photography Club. Today is Monday, January 29th, 2024. Our program this evening is Kurt Budliger, and he's going to talk to us about when and how to use a wide angle to enhance our nature photography. But before we get started on that, we have some announcements to make. Our next meeting is going to be on February the 12th. It's going to be an image review. We had a couple trips last week, and I'm going to ask Mary Fox if she would give us an update on our trip to the Capitol. Mary, are you there?
I'm here, Joe. Yeah, the Capitol shoot was a success. We had about 15 members and friends that came, and a very nice lady named Jen Haynes and her associate Adam. They spoke to us about different areas like the Rotunda, the Senate, the Matt Ryan building, and took us on to the areas, explained everything, and everybody had ample opportunity to take like so many shots. You could take like tiny things or panorama shots. And if you look on our Facebook site, you'll see a lot of photographs that people took, and everyone seemed to have a really good time. And there's never enough time there, though, Joe, So I think we'll all look forward to going again. And we missed a lot of people, or a lot of regulars that we usually see at these shoots. So hope we see more next time.
It rained. I guess maybe that was part of the thing. I don't know, but
maybe.
We had a trip to the Susquehanna Art Museum, and Mike Donovan, can you give us an update on that?
Yes, we had probably close to 20 people there, maybe a little more even. And we got to see some challenging work. It was nice to step outside of our comfort zones a little bit and see some photographs that chances are we would not see during an image review or during a competition here at the club. So it was nice to, like I said, step out of the comfort zone and to see photographs from a real a pillar of modern photography.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a real good turnout, and it was really great to see work by Deanne Arbus here, because that's not the usual thing. They told me at the museum people had come from Manhattan, from Washington, D.C., from Baltimore to come and see the display. And to walk in and give the guy $5 and get to see Deanne Arbus stuff is just great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. I'm going to ask Mark Abano has arranged for a really cool trip coming up this weekend. Mark, would you want to tell everybody about that trip you have coming up?
Sure. This Saturday, we are going to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. We'll be leaving around 8 in the morning from the Arby's and the Giant at the parking lot in Camp Hill. A couple of things I want to bring up real quick is that the introduction, the announcement of it had several links to it. It will pay to read those documents. There is a if you're going to come and take photos, I recommend using a tripod, but there is a tripod fee. It's an extra $10. Okay. If you've never been there before, there's a self-guided audio tour that I thought was very good. And the other and also bring snacks with you, because we're going to get there probably between 10 and 10:30, 2 hours or more. You could easily spend 2 hours plus in there. I would bring snacks because they don't allow re-entry. I checked on that. So you can't buy a ticket, leave, and come back in. And also, the facility is not heated except for one room. So dress accordingly for the weather. That's it, Joe.
Okay. And there's lots of detail. And Mark, you have on the latest email going out with information on it too, with some videos, so they have an idea of what to expect. That's going to be a great trip. Thank you for doing that. Okay. And we have a lot of new things coming up. I'm just going to rattle off the what we're going to be doing, but you don't have to write any of this down because it'll be in your email for tomorrow. I mentioned that we have on February the 12th, the image review, and then we have a trip to Strasburg Railroad. We have Bert Sirkin giving us a presentation on keeping your photography fresh. Going to go to Gordonville Mud Sales, which is the Amish, and they do allow people to take pictures. You may have like 500 Amish people there selling their wares. And then we have a new program, your top images from 2023. So start getting those ready and you'll be able to submit them. And we're going to have a show with your images in there. We have a trip to an industrial bookmaker, Maple Press. Rich Hudson, our treasurer, is the CFO of that relatively large company manufacturing books. And we're going to tour that. And we're going to be photographing industrial equipment, huge equipment. We have Ian Plant coming up, and then Kurt Wilkie from our group here is working on the snow geese. Now that's one that we're not going to put a date to because we have to judge that one based upon the temperature, the geese, and that'll be a pop-up kind of a thing. So those are the trips we have coming up. But our program this evening is with Kurt Budliger. Kurt is from Vermont, northern Vermont, and he's a nature photographer for about the last 20 years. He started a company called the Green Mountain Photo Workshops. His clients include people like the Nat Geo Adventure, Outside Magazine, Pop Photo, Outdoor Photography, Patagonia, Trouts Unlimited, and he does numerous workshops. You'll get a link to him in the email tomorrow, which will have the recording of this presentation. We're going to ask that what you do is you put your questions in chat, and then we'll monitor it. And we may break in with Kurt to answer some of the questions, or we may hold them to the end. So just put your questions in the chat. I'm also going to ask that everybody mute themselves. And if you do need to talk, you can then unmute yourself where you can push the space bar. But if you would mute yourself, we would really appreciate that. There's some feedback I'm hearing now from somebody. So if you could just mute yourself, that'd be great. So with that in mind, Kurt, you want to share your screen and we're ready to go.
Certainly. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, West Shore Camera Club, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here after a couple of failed attempts due to unforeseen circumstances out of my control. I am Kurt Budliger, as Joe said. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will jump right into tonight's presentation.
We can see it
All
fine.
right. All right, excellent. So as Joe mentioned, I like to keep things, somewhat informal in the sense that, if you do have a question during my program, feel free to type it into the chat, and Joe's going to monitor the chat. And if the question is, particularly germane to whatever I'm talking about at the moment or whatever image we're viewing at the moment, he'll break in. But otherwise, I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have after the program. I am a full-time professional, whatever that means these days, landscape and nature photographer. I've always been interested in imagery, even since I was a little kid. When I was in school, if I got a school project or something to work on that had a visual component, that was where I put most of my energy. I was all about, the images, how I was going to illustrate whatever concept the project happened to be about. And then I was really into being outdoors all the time as well. I studied natural resources at Colorado State University, where I got my undergraduate degree. Whereas my dad likes to joke, I got a master's degree in backcountry skiing and craft beer drinking. But anyway, but my graduation gift from college was my first 35 millimeter camera and a couple of lenses, and that literally changed the trajectory of my life. And so I pursued a not so lucrative career as an outdoor and environmental educator and outdoor naturalist and guide. And after traveling quite a bit and working seasonally, I decided the next most logical step in pursuing the big bucks was to go back to school and get a master's degree in education and become a public school teacher. So that's what I did. And that's what brought me to where I now live in Vermont. I've been here for almost 25 years now, and I was a middle school science teacher for the first 8 years that I was here, but just all the while, just staying really focused, no pun intended, on pursuing photography as a career. And when my youngest was born, I decided to take the next most logical step in pursuing financial independence, and that's becoming a professional photographer. So I left teaching and jumped full forced into photography and haven't looked back since. So I've done a lot of different things in photography, everything from portraits to weddings and commercial work. But my true love is being outdoors and photographing the natural landscape. So this evening's theme is go big or go home. To kind of quote one of my good friends who will be presenting for you guys, I hear coming up pretty soon, Ian Plant. And Ian, I think, aside from being a good friend, he's also been someone who sort of has always pushed me over the years to sort of learning to see big, learning to create really dynamic and interesting and engaging landscapes with a wide angle perspective. So, and he's about as good at it as anyone I know. So. Let's jump right in here. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a wide angle landscape? So in my mind, I typically think of a wide angle landscape as something, wider than like 30, certainly wider than 35 millimeters. I may not look it, but I'm old enough to remember, the days before, anything wider than 24 millimeters. But nowadays, we can get lenses that are 10 millimeters and not even considered fisheye. And so I think in today's with today's technology and the plethora of equipment options that we have, certainly anything from 11 millimeters up to probably 24 millimeters is what I consider to be wide angle. I'm finding these days that most of my wide angle imagery falls kind of right in that 14 to 16 millimeter focal length. And when I'm designing and thinking about photographing wide angle landscapes, or any wide angle, well, particularly outdoor images, I'm thinking about, a perspective that's including some distant horizon, a good chunk of sky, as well as whatever your nearest or closer subject matter might be. So, here's a great example of what I'm talking about. This is a pond here in Vermont, not too far from where I live, that I've been visiting now for about 25 years in all sorts of seasons. But when you've got a big sky with a lot of beautiful clouds, this happens to be at sunrise. This to me is the type of scene that really lends itself to going really wide. Here's another rural scene here in Vermont, not probably too unlike some of the scenery near where y'all live in parts of Pennsylvania. And then this was, I guess, the image that was included in the announcement, the email blast that went around to everyone about tonight's program. And in this shot, this is in Iceland. Probably seen photographs from this location before. I call this image Last Frame. And the reason it's called Last Frame is that it literally was the last frame captured by the camera that I happened to be using at the time before it gave up the ghost and completely died and succumbed to too much moisture. I'd been shooting for about 4 or 5 days in the rain, which is very common in Iceland. And the salt and sea spray at this location did not help matters at all. So this literally was the last frame that came off of the memory card for that shot. Here's another example of a very wide angle landscape. This is another scene from Iceland called Brurfoss, taken back in the days when you could still pretty much almost drive right to this location and park your car and maybe walk a couple hundred yards, maybe at the most, to this beautiful location. But when you've got a big, beautiful sky like that, it really lends itself to going wide. Another example, this is probably shot at 14 millimeters out in Death Valley National Park in the Mesquite Dunes. Olympic National Park. One of my favorite scenes or types of imagery to make are seascapes, and I think there's no better place than Olympic National Park for outdoor photography. You get everything from these gorgeous coastal scenes with beautiful sea stacks and rugged coastline to amazing rainforest scenery, all within a matter of, a couple of miles. This is out in Canyonlands National Park. And we're going to talk a lot about sort of coming up, some of the things, the considerations that, we need to make when we're using these lenses to make images like this. All right, so those were all examples of scenes that included a really big dynamic sky as well as that distant horizon, and then also some closer elements within the scene. But wide-angle landscapes are not just for that type of imagery. Here's an example of using a wide-angle lens to create an intimate landscape where there is no sky. So there are lots of opportunities to use this perspective. In forests here, photographing along this stream. This stream is, I'm fortunate to live about maybe 10 minutes from the stream. I visit it quite often. Down in slot canyons, we can use these wide angle lenses in order to create these intimate scenes or these intimate images, and I'll talk more about some of the considerations for doing so. Another example, this is Jordan Stream in Acadia National Park. This is actually not this past fall, but the fall before, after a tropical storm came through and dumped probably 4 or 5 inches of rain and refreshed all of the streams. This is out in the Tetons, some lupin as our focal point in the foreground, and some nice crepuscular rays of light coming down from the top of the frame. And then this is, a very small grouping of ferns literally on the edge of my yard that I photographed one day after, walking past it 6 times while mowing the lawn. And so these kinds of scenes can be photographed literally anywhere if we're willing to kind of open our eyes and observe. But filling the frame and getting that lens really, really close to the ground and filling the frame with that wonderful pattern. All right, so what is so special about wide-angle lenses? Well, one of the things that makes them interesting is that they provide an extreme angle of view. In fact, it's so extreme, it's more extreme and more encompassing, I guess, if you will, than how our eyes, the focal length that our eyes are at. I've read that, the human eye is somewhere between, a 35 millimeter to 50 millimeter equivalent in perspective. And, that's not wide angle. And so when we start getting wider than that, things start to change, things get exaggerated. Objects that are close to the camera, close to the lens, appear larger, while objects that are further away in the background can appear smaller, which presents some challenges. And one of the biggest issues that people have, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit, is that when we're photographing with a wide-angle lens, in a big mountain range that seems ominous and imposing to us in the scene, kind of becomes somewhat diminished in the background, and that's due to that exaggeration, that extreme perspective. Here's another example. This is out in Utah at Dead Horse Point State Park near Canyonlands. And in this particular shot, I've taken folks here and shown on workshops and shown them where this particular bush is, where this shrub is. And they're always amazed when they actually see it in person at how small it is. It appears in the scene, in the photograph, to be, quite large because the camera is very, very close to it. And the size of that shrub is exaggerated, as are the 2 rocks coming in from right and left. So here's a scene that I shot for comparison to just show you to illustrate what happens when you put a wide angle lens on to things in the background. These 2 images, this was at probably 14 millimeters. This is out in Colorado. And then this is almost the same image taken from the same spot at 35 millimeters. And when we've got that big wide angle view, things in the background, they get very, very small. And those mountains that's Red Mountain Pass in the background, you know, they're 12,000 foot peaks. And they look absolutely tiny in this view. But here now, you know, they've maintained their sort of impressive stature. So it's all about working within the limitations of the equipment. I shot this little sequence as just sort of an illustration to show us, you know, sort of how much more real estate we get as we kind of zoom out to a wider perspective. So these were all shot with a, I believe, oh no, actually, I think I had to use 2 different lenses. But anyway, 35 millimeters. This is in my yard. And basically, the only thing that's changing from image to image is the focal length. So it shot this on a tripod, didn't move the camera, just changed the zoom. And we see the same foreground goldenrod in each of the frames. So here at 35 millimeters, we've got foreground with the goldenrod and some other flowers, my pond in the background, and really not much in the way of sky, if any. 30 millimeters, a little bit more foreground. Now the sky's starting to creep in. 24 millimeters, much more of the goldenrod in the foreground, a lot more of the background, lots of sky. Trees are starting to appear much, much smaller. 20 millimeters, 16 millimeters, and then finally at 14 millimeters. It's a much different scene than, you know, than the first several photographs. And so how do we go about using this lens to really make captivating images? All right, so where are we going to use this lens? Well, this is one of those sort of, you know, anywhere really. I mean, you can make wide angle images literally anywhere. You do not need to travel to, you know, far away exotic lands. We're inundated with photographs. You know, if you've spent any time on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and the like, you're constantly seeing these just amazing locations, you know, like in Norway or Iceland or Patagonia. Lots of stuff I've been seeing lately from Antarctica. But you don't need to travel to those faraway lands to make really compelling wide angle landscapes. This image was taken here in Vermont, you know, obviously during the autumn. But the composition, I think, is just as dynamic and interesting without having to travel super far away. Of course, it's fun to travel. And so if you are traveling, definitely bring that wide angle lens with you. This is in Patagonia. I'm not sure. I don't think this was the trip that Joe and I spent a little time together in Patagonia. So we're going to play a little game during this presentation, which photographs were made on a trip with Joe Farrell. I don't think that this one was with you, Joe, unfortunately. We did visit a location near here, though. This one was, though, Joe.
Absolutely.
Yes. This was a great afternoon at Perito Moreno Glacier on the first day of our Patagonia tour. And we had a passing shower and a bit of light pop out, and a wonderful rainbow appeared. And this, of course, this is in Iceland. This is probably one of the more famous waterfalls in Iceland, the Seljalandsfoss, in the summertime at sunset. And if you've been here, you know, but if you haven't been here, the footprint of this waterfall where it hits that pool of water is gigantic. I mean, it would encompass my entire house, I think. There's this great path that leads back behind the waterfall, and so you can brave the elements and soak your camera. I think this might be one of the reasons that my camera died on that subsequent shot a few days later. Closer to home here in Vermont, big dynamic sky. My rule of thumb when shooting wide angle is I only include the sky if something is interesting in the sky or if something is happening in the sky. If there are some interesting lines or shapes, certainly sunrise or sunset, beautiful colors and clouds, clearing storms, things like that, which we'll talk a lot more about. Another example of an intimate landscape made with a wide angle, getting very, very close to this small cascade and exaggerating the size of these falls. These falls they look much bigger than they actually are in this photograph. All right, so when do we do this? So with all landscape photography, it really just depends on the type of mood and atmosphere and story that you are wanting to tell. So we can use these lenses any time of day, really. If you are a landscape or outdoor photographer, certainly, sort of the holy grail of landscape photography are those fiery sunrises and sunsets. And so this, to me, is when I'm usually reaching for my wide angle lens, when there's something really interesting, as I said, happening in the sky, and I want to feature how that sky is interacting with the land mass, that I'm on and in. If there is not something interesting happening in the sky, I would hesitate to go very wide, right? Because, if you're outdoors and you're shooting at 14 millimeters, and you're not composing in a forest or something like that, you're going to have some sky. So there better be something really interesting happening. If you are shooting in the forest and you're shooting in an intimate kind of style and smaller vignettes of landscapes and nature, then I would hesitate to include any sky. And I oftentimes want to shoot in soft, kind of overcast light, so that we don't have really bright highlights or super dark shadows. And on those particular days, the sky is not very interesting. The best, on those rainy days or those overcast days, the sky is really just going to appear as kind of just a white, ugly blob. And if you've just got little patches of white kind of peering in from the forest canopy, that's going to be visually distracting. And so in this case, we had a big rain the night before, and it brought down a lot of leaves. And so the stream bank was just completely covered with these super vibrant red maple leaves. And so that's what I used to build the photograph around, and filled the frame with just those elements. So that nice soft light, as I mentioned, it provides a much easier sort of tonal range to work in. You're not going to have super bright highlights that you have to worry about clipping on your histogram, or dark shadows. And so it's, and if the light's not changing, then you can kind of calm down. It's a much different, I guess, experience, much more relaxing than, trying to work under highly variable conditions and trying to time sunrise or sunset, where you really maybe only have a couple of minutes to get the shot. On a day where it's overcast and cloudy, maybe even a little showery, you can relax and spend all day in the forest shooting. And for me, this is my favorite type of shooting. I love, the big dramatic examples of Mother Nature and sunrises and sunsets and clearing storms, but I also like the calm, sort of peaceful kind of vibe of shooting when the light is soft and overcast. During those fiery sunsets, don't be afraid of backlight. I think it's probably one of the more dramatic types of light to shoot in. It can be challenging, but it gives your images a little extra sort of oomph, a little extra pop, if you will, a little bit more dynamism. Same thing in the forest too. I'm going to contradict what I just said a minute ago, where you don't want to include any of the sky if you're photographing intimate scenes in the forest. But in this particular example, the sun had just come up over the ridge. This is in the White Mountains in New Hampshire in the fall, obviously. But I waited for the sun to get up over the mountain range and kind of start bleeding down into this birch stand, and then used a very small aperture in the lens and played a little hide and seek with the sun behind some trunks of the trees in order to create that sun star, or that flare. And you want to use a nice small aperture to make that effect. So these kinds of images, I think, are they're very successful. That little bit of light, draws the eye a little deeper into the frame and gives the image a little bit more visual interest. Here's another example doing something similar, not including the sky, but including a bit of the sun as it kind of breaks over the horizon of these trees in this cranberry bog. And again, using a small aperture so that the rays of light become more accentuated as they pass through the blades of your aperture. You really have to play around with your particular lens. Not all lenses make the same, I guess, quality sun star, if you will. And depending on the number of blades in the aperture, that's going to determine how many actual rays of light you can see in the sun star. And so you really have to kind of play around with the lens. I've noticed that the newer lenses, it used to be the Canon, there was a Canon 16-35 that for years and years and years was just made the most beautiful sun star of any lens around. And now I've noticed so many more lenses have just super high quality sun stars. So you really have to test out your particular lens to see how you like it. Here's another example of shooting backlit, a backlit scene, and shooting an intimate scene, wide angle. Another nice thing about backlight is that it just sort of creates this nice gauzy sort of low contrast, but bright and kind of airy feel to the image. So here I'm shooting into the sun, but the sun is just outside of the upper portion of the frame, but it creates those nice shadows and brings out all of those cracks in the mud in the foreground. All right, side light. Aside from backlight, like if I'm going to have light, direct light on a scene, then backlight is my favorite, I think, as far as just visual interest and drama, if you will. But side light, I really, really love as well, because it brings out texture and brings out definition and detail and helps create depth in the scene. When the sun is directly behind you and illuminating the front of your subject, it just winds up being sort of flat and kind of boring. All right, so how are we going to go about making these dynamic wide angle landscapes? All right, this, I think, actually, Joe, this was our first night. Yep, here's our first one that Joe, or our second one that was where Joe and I were together. This is in Torres del Paine in Chile. The first night of our trip, I think, and we were able to stumble out of our hotel and scamper down some rocks to get out to this beach and photograph Los Cuernos. All right, so the number one, I guess, thing that I feel like has to be considered when you're using a wide angle lens is finding something to fill the frame, finding a foreground element, particularly if it's going to be a shot that includes the sky. You've got to find foreground. So as we know, photographs are two-dimensional representations of a three-dimensional world, right? And when we're photographing, we're experiencing not only the depth of the scene in real time, and how we're interpreting, the world in three dimensions, but we're also, experiencing the smells and the sounds. And so when we take a photograph, all of that is lost. And so our job is to try to recreate or, give the illusion of having depth in the scene. And I think this is particularly important when shooting a big wide angle scene. And, one of my goals is to create an image that makes the viewer feel like they could step right into the scene. What does it feel like to actually be sitting here on these rocks, or walking into this scene? And I think those are the types of images that really kind of capture the viewer's attention and hold their eye and, providing enough stuff for the viewer to kind of move through the frame. And so without, we've all read and we've heard probably lots and lots of talks about, sort of compositional strategies and quote unquote rules, like the rule of thirds and things like that, the rule of odds and all of that good stuff. And I hesitate to use, I never liked rules when I was a kid, and I kind of still don't like them now as an adult. And I always, every time I hear the word rule, I'm like, oh, well, what does that mean? And how can I break it? But I would rather think of those things like, thirds as being a strategy. And there are times and there are reasons why it's effective. Moving the main subject out of the middle of the frame tends to create a little bit more tension, a little bit more visual interest. My friend Ian, who you guys will hear from soon, and I made a joke that, it depends how many Ian Plant stories I tell, but I guess I think I don't know if he actually came up with this himself, but I learned about it from him, and I think it's a great way of thinking about the elements within the frame, right? If you think about it, when we're making a photograph, we're taking everything that we want in the world, and we're just kind of arranging it inside those four little walls, that little rectangle. Okay. And so we need to think about the elements within the frame as each having some amount of visual mass. And by visual mass, I think what we're talking about is really just like how much attention it garners as an element or a subject within the frame. And so in this particular photo, it's a very simple, minimalistic scene of a photographer with a tripod and a camera, and this in silhouette on the edge of a rock. And then there's this tiny little crescent moon in that upper left-hand corner. Well, all of those elements have some amount of visual mass, right? The photographer and the silhouetted rocks, they're very dominant because they're large in the frame, and they're also very dark in an otherwise brighter frame. But that little tiny bright white crescent moon also has some amount of visual mass or visual interest, right? It garners our attention. And our goal is to be constantly sort of metacognating and thinking about all the elements in the frame and how do I arrange them so that they are balanced within the frame and with one another. Okay. So there's two different kinds of balance. There's what we call dynamic balance and static balance. Okay. So I like to think of them also as like, if you sort of envision, a teeter-totter on a playground, right? When we think of the teeter-totter as being balanced, oftentimes we think of it as being completely level, right? Both sides off of the ground, and it's totally level, horizontal with the ground, and one side is neither higher nor lower, right? And so that's how I would describe static balance. So static balance, something, so here we've got an illustration of that. We've got the horizon of the lake, kind of right through the middle of the frame. We've got that little grouping of flamingos in the foreground. And there, the frame is kind of balanced almost equally top and bottom, right? We've got a dark kind of shadowed background and then a brighter foreground. And there's balance. They're sort of equaling each other out, but in a static way. Now, however, we have, and this was the original photo, by the way. I just took the flamingo out for the first one to create this illustration. This is now what I would consider to be more dynamically balanced. So we've got, the amount of visual mass of the flamingos in the foreground is being counterbalanced or counterweighted, if you will, by the flamingo coming in from the upper left. They're not equal to one another. So if you think about that teeter-totter, right, now we've gone from being completely level to being a little bit off level, but neither side is touching the ground, right? Both sides are off the ground, so it's in a state of balance, but it's in a state of more dynamic balance, and it's got more tension in the scene. And to me, that's the type of balance I'm going for when I'm making compositions. How can I balance the elements in the frame, but do so in a dynamic way so that there's a little bit of tension and more visual interest? Here's another example. So here is the static balance, now more dynamically balanced. And once again, this was the original shot. I took the rock out to provide the illustration. But for me, this one has more visual interest because there's a little bit more dynamism. We don't have sort of almost equal parts land and sky. Now we have this one smaller, bright, white-ish rock in the foreground that breaks up that larger, darker reflecting pool and creates a little bit of tension, but it has a lot of visual mass, but not so much that it commands all of our attention. And for me, it kind of is balancing that diagonal line of clouds that are kind of all dropping down. And I was very intentional about how I lined the shot up. I really wanted sort of the way that the V shape of those clouds coming down into the foreground, I wanted that to kind of, almost look like it was going to intersect with that rock in the foreground. So, we want to be thinking about this concept of balance. Here's another example where we've got these larger hoodoos, almost, not quite, but almost silhouetted, quite dark, but not silhouetted, but against a much brighter sky. And then we've also got a couple of smaller, broken off pieces of rock in the midground, which are all more kind of dynamically balanced against that foreground rock. All right. So how do we arrange these elements to create this sort of sense of balance? There's another example of adding, using light to create an element in the frame that creates something that creates dynamic balance or adds visual mass and a little bit more tension. And so I could have shot this without the sun star and it would have been fine. But I think adding that little burst of light right at the edge of that arch helps to pull the eye deeper into the frame and give the scene a little bit more tension and dynamism. All right, another, I think, objective is going to be to sort of create, again, what Ian Plant refers to as visual flow, right? Where we're using elements within the frame to draw the eye or move the eye through the frame. And this is, I think, super, super important when shooting wide angle landscapes or using our wide angle lens in most outdoor scenarios versus throwing on a telephoto lens and isolating patterns and things like that. Those are great types of images to make. But if you are incorporating anything that's close to the camera and far away from the camera, we need to create some kind of pathway for the eye to move through the frame. And so here, using this foreground pool with the swirls and then the shape of the stream, photographing streams, it works perfectly for creating these visual pathways. All right, so wide angle lenses, as I said before, exaggerate the size and scale of objects. And the other really great thing about that is that it can help create this sort of near-far relationship, right? And that helps to create depth or move the eye, aiding in that visual flow from foreground to background. So here, shooting wide, probably 16 millimeters, getting pretty close to these sunflower heads, and then having that bright burst of sun in the background, helps create that near-far relationship. Getting close is really, really key. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but when you're photographing with a wide angle lens, you have to spend some time wandering around looking for something to use as foreground, right? And so here I got really, really close to this rock or this crack in the rock, these rocks, and was very intentional about how I lined the camera up so that crack in the rock, formed that sort of nice diagonal line that works its way from lower right, up higher to the left. And then the sun has sort of a spot almost to drop down, right into that crack. And because I'm shooting wide, I think this is probably at least 14 millimeters. This rock is not very big. The distance across this crack is maybe only a couple of inches, but here it looks much, much larger. So it exaggerates the size and it helps lead the eye deeper into the frame. All right, so I've kind of mentioned this a couple of times already, but I can't emphasize it enough. Wide angle landscapes, it's absolutely essential to find great foreground. And we really need to be thinking about zones within the scene, right? So from front to mid to back, and finding elements and positions so that we can make compositions where the eye moves from something dynamic in the foreground to a midground and to a background. So this is where your feet are really, really important. There is no lens that you can magically put on your camera that will instantly create beautiful and dynamic foregrounds. That happens with your feet. And that's just spending time wandering around and looking, okay? The other thing about wide angle lens, and I see this all the time on workshops, where I'll be watching somebody working in the field and I try to figure out what it is they're shooting before I, ask them how they're doing and ask if I can kind of see what they're working on. And then as soon as I realize that they're shooting with a wide angle lens, I can instantly tell whether or not I'm going to like the photograph by how close they are to the subject. And it's really critical to get close. At least I think. So here I am. This is fairly close. I mean, I'm wearing waders, standing in the water, trying very carefully not to, slip and fall. But pay particularly close attention to that mid-ground shape that kind of looks like the trunk of an elephant. And so now I'm close, and here I am even closer. And this is, I think, a much more dynamic composition because the shape now of that falls and the darker shadowed water against the bright white water creates that nice little zigzag. So get close and then get closer. Robert Capa, who was a famous war correspondent, famously said, if your pictures aren't good enough, then you are not close enough. There's some irony in that statement because unfortunately he was killed stepping on a landmine, so he got too close. But it is important to get as close as you can to your subject. So, and this is really the biggest mistake I see people making, is not getting close enough to their primary foreground elements with their wide angle lenses.
Eric,
Yeah,
can I interrupt you for a second? When you
Sure.
meant a question came in, when you mentioned getting close, like for instance, on this shot here or the one previous, are you like an inch away, a foot away? Tell us what is close.
all right. Yes. It really depends on the subject. And this is where, and I'll talk more about this in a second, but
Okay.
I'm a big fan of what I call working the scene. And I have a slide in here at some point soon to remind me that we don't, and I mentioned this already, we don't see at a 14 millimeter perspective. Our brains are not wired that way. Our eyes are, they're not, they don't work that way. That's not how we see the world. So the only way that you can learn to see wide angle compositions is by actually putting a wide angle lens on your camera and looking through the camera. I remember the first time I got a lens that had a perspective wider than 20 millimeters. When I first looked through the camera and could see my feet, I was blown away. And then when I started playing with getting closer to subjects, whether it was, interesting shaped rocks with lichen on them or clumps of flowers or whatever it was, it just started to really blow my mind. So you really have to put that lens on the camera and spend time wandering around and see what you see through the camera. And so, to Joe's question, like how close is close? Well, it really depends. Like a lot of questions in photography, it depends on the subject. It depends on, what your background is. It depends on the shapes of those foreground elements, but as close as you need to get. And so I've got this refrain going in my head whenever I'm photographing. I see something that interests me. I get the camera out. I think it might be a wide angle shot. I'll put a wide angle lens on, and then I'll just start walking around with the camera off the tripod. I use a tripod all the time for shooting, and I think they're extremely valuable tools, but for a variety of reasons, not just making for sharper images. It slows us down and allows us to really refine a composition, but they're cumbersome. And for creating the compositions, for working the scene, they can be inhibiting. And so I recommend taking the camera off the tripod because you'll be much more apt to get down on your knees, to climb up on something, to get physically really, really close and see what it looks like. And then when you have that aha moment where you start to see the composition coming together through the lens and the camera, and you make the composition, then set the tripod up so that the camera can achieve that vision. But you've really got to get that lens on the camera and spend time working the scene, wandering around, trying different angles, getting down low, getting close, getting up high, pointing the camera down, really just playing with it. And so, here's a perfect example. Like this shot, I never would have made if the camera had been on the tripod. I was shooting this waterfall and I turned around and I looked up behind me and I saw these beautiful ferns and these really interesting devil's club leaves. And so I climbed up on the steep hillside and I got the camera, got the 14 millimeter on, and I'm playing around, hand holding. And then once I got the composition figured out, then I got the tripod. And it's gotten to be almost a joke now with me where, I look for like the most annoying, most difficult place that I could possibly imagine setting up a tripod. And I say, well, I'm just going to end up there anyway. I might as well just walk over there right now. But the refrain I always have in my head is, okay, now what? Now what, Kurt? How can I make this better? What if I get closer? What if I go wider? What if I go up higher? Okay, now what? How can I make this better? All right. So as I mentioned a second ago, wide angle landscapes, are the key to them, I think, are having foreground, midground, background kind of all working harmoniously. Now, oftentimes, the beginning of sort of the seeds of the photograph for me is the background. It's what's happening in the landscape. Like there's a beautiful mountain. This is Kirkjufell in Iceland. You know, beautiful mountain with gorgeous late evening light on the mountain and dark, moody sky, and then beautiful reflection on this pond of water. Now I find the foreground. So it often starts with the background, right? If you're going to go wide, what is in the background? Okay, now what can I find in the foreground to help balance that background and provide that sort of near-far relationship and get the viewer feeling like they could step into the scene. Okay. And so here it was wandering around the shoreline until I found a nice triangular shaped rock, a nice spot where I could capture the entirety of the reflection. And then I'm off to the races. All right. Background, you know, clearing storm. This is the coast of Maine and Acadia National Park. Sunset's about to happen. And so now it's a matter of finding foreground. So oftentimes it really is the background that starts the train, and you've got to find the foreground to go with it. And I knew, you know, I wanted to capture some breaking waves in the background. That's actually a very famous spot in the background called Thunder Hole, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And then using this beautiful reflected light on this wet rock in the foreground to create that near-far relationship. All right, so foregrounds and compositions are built around shapes, okay? And so one of my favorite shapes, and actually, that's funny, this photograph is the print that's behind me on the wall, I'm just realizing. One of my favorite shapes to look for in the landscape are triangles, because triangles have that nice pointy angle that you can use to point the eye wherever it is you want it to go. So how many triangles can we see in this particular scene? Well, there are some obvious ones, right? Like that foreground rock in the lower left and the sort of cliff line coming down from the mid upper left. But look at all these other triangles. So it's not just sort of the objective shape of a rock as a triangle, but the sort of space between things, right? Like in the foreground where those cobbles are, that's forming a little bit of a more abstract triangle. The gaps in the clouds are forming little triangles, right? And all of those triangles are acting to push the eye deeper and deeper into the frame. So a triangle for me is one of the more sort of powerful and useful shapes that I look for when I'm making compositions. Here's another example. There's triangles everywhere in this shot, right? Really dominant foreground triangle. And here's a perfect example of how the beginning of the composition, the seeds of the composition was the background, because I saw the shapes in the clouds. I knew they were going to start lighting up at sunset. They had these beautiful radiating lines kind of coming up from the horizon. And I thought, okay, I have got to wander around this beach until I find a suitable foreground that I can use to match or complement the sky. And I got super lucky. And then I found this really wonderful triangular shaped foreground rock. And then that's complemented by the other triangular shaped rocks in the midground. So dynamic foreground leads into a complementary midground, right? And then it gets you to the background. So you want that, you have to be thinking in those three zones: foreground, midground, and background. Here's another example: wide angle, probably 14 or 16 millimeters, but in the forest this time. And here it wasn't so much the background that was driving the composition. Well, I guess I'm going to back up. It kind of was the background driving the composition, because I really loved the way the backlight was coming into the forest. And I loved that the highlights on the surface of the water and that sort of subtle little S curve as it snakes through the midground. And so then it was, okay, I want to find some nice fallen leaves. I want to find some nice rocks. This stream happens to be kind of unique in my area. We don't have a lot of moss-covered rocks on the streams where I live. So this was kind of a unique location. And once again, triangle-shaped rock in the foreground and midground. And the question always comes up, did you put those leaves there? The answer is no, maybe one or two. It's called nature augmentation. All right, so here's another one where background drives the composition. Okay, this is down in Patagonia at Torres del Paine. And when I see interesting shapes in the sky, in the clouds, that gets me thinking about finding a complementary shape for my foreground so that you've got that nice balance between top and bottom of the frame. And so I love these wispy clouds over Los Cuernos. And those mountains the mountains are majestic all by themselves. They're incredible. But I found this really nice foreground rock that mimics not only the shape of the clouds, but also the shape of the Cuernos, or the horns, as they're called, the mountains that we see. And I was very careful to position the camera so that that bottom edge of the rock did not obscure the peaks, right? So having to move the camera up and down until those peaks were not obscured, and they're framed nicely at the bottom of the frame there, or they're framed nicely by the rocks at the bottom of the frame. More triangles. This is here closer to my home. This is Lake Champlain over near Burlington, looking across at the Adirondacks in New York State, with a very long exposure, probably 30 seconds at least. But the shapes of the rocks provide those sort of stepping stones, if you will, to move the eye deeper into the frame. All right, we've all learned about leading lines and zigzags and curves, right? Those are super, dynamic shapes that are very energetic, and we can use them to lead the eye. So not only things like, triangles to point the eye, but zigzags and curves, they're just very natural pathways for the eye to move. So things like, portions of the stream here. Once again, I noticed that the way the clouds were lighting up were creating kind of like these radiating spokes of light coming from the horizon. And I knew, okay, well, I need to find something, or want to find something that's going to mimic those shapes to use as foreground. But I couldn't find any suitable sort of rocks, but thought, oh, you know what? Well, maybe some waves, the white foamy water as it retreats back out to sea with a slower shutter speed, maybe like a 1 second long exposure, 1 second long shutter speed, and creating those nice long lines that we see here, which mimic the shape of the clouds, or the lines in the clouds. So it's almost like spokes radiating out from the horizon up into the sky, as well as down into the foreground. And then, oh, lo and behold, in the lower left portion, my favorite shape, the triangle. Vanishing point is another technique. And, this can be very useful in creating depth in our images. We know that, lines like train tracks or the edge of a path or something like that, in this case, the traps stacked up on this dock, they're going to run parallel with one another, but as they recede into the distance, we get the illusion that they're converging in the distance, right, to some distant point where they're actually going to maybe touch. And that's our vanishing point. And that's an extremely useful technique for wide angle shots, or wide angle lens images. And it just provides a very natural, very dynamic path for the eye to move deeper into the frame. Shooting down a road. This is a classic example. Actually, Joe, this was another shot from that Patagonia trip. This was on our way to, this was, I think, on our way to Perito Moreno Glacier. But yeah, shooting down the road. I mean, we know that road, the sides of the road aren't going to converge and touch off in the distance, right? But they reach that point at which it just vanishes, and that just pulls the eye, into the frame and creates a lot of depth. Bridges, boardwalks, trails, pathways, all can be used this way. And you can use your wide angle lens. And again, get close. Here, this is Marshall Point Lighthouse on the coast of Maine. And not only does the railing and the boardwalk going out to this lighthouse create that vanishing point, but I guess it doesn't really vanish. It terminates at the lighthouse, right? So everything goes right to that lighthouse. And then also I've got that great radiating pattern of clouds in the sky, which kind of mimic the shapes in the foreground as well. So you can really accentuate all of those shapes with the wide angle lens. And this all, I guess, can be sort of summed up by something that Minor White once said: one should not only photograph things for what they are, but what else they are, right? So here's an example. Yes, these are boulders and rocks, but what else are they? Well, by now we should start to see, well, they're triangles, they're lines, right? Like the cobbles on the left side of the more prominent rock, they form a bit of an S curve, right? As from foreground to midground to background. And then that one prominent rock in the middle ground is shaped like a triangle and lines up perfectly with the cloud coming down from the upper left-hand corner. All of those choices were intentional. And so as we're making compositions and we're spending time wandering around, I can't emphasize this enough. You've got to move your body. You can't just get out of the car and park it. You've got to spend time wandering around and seeing these elements within the landscape for not only what they are, but what else they are. You know, what shapes do they form? What patterns do they make? Here's another example. This is a forest scene here near Stowe, Vermont, near where I live in Smuggler's Notch. And this downed birch trunk creates a wonderful, perfect little S curve that leads out into the midground. And then there's a couple triangular shaped rocks, a couple well-placed yellow leaves to create another diagonal line to lead the viewer's eye deeper into the frame. So, what else are these things? Yeah, it's a wave flowing off of the rocks, but it creates a very strong diagonal line that I can use as a foreground element and matches or mimics the shape of the bright orange cloud in the sky. And all of those elements have visual masses, as I said before. And so how do we arrange them to create some kind of balance within the frame? Here, the foreground elements are the receding waves, right? Not just the rocks, but the waves themselves. And I do a whole talk on photographing flowing water, but different shutter speeds and experimenting with different shutter speeds and creating different amounts of blur will help in kind of getting your creative juices flowing and learning to see the potential for shapes that you can use as foregrounds. Here's another one. This is from Olympic National Park as well. Again, the sky dictated the entire photograph. The clouds were just so amazing on this particular late afternoon before sunset, but the color wasn't very good. And so I knew it was going to be black and white from the get-go, but I knew that when I saw these clouds and I wanted to photograph them, I had to find some suitable foreground. And so here, the way the waves are breaking and wrapping almost like fingers of foam around the rocks in the foreground, creating these nice sort of almost like pillows, almost like the shape of the clouds in the sky. And that became the foreground. All right, we've seen this photograph already, but here again, these wonderful clouds in the sky driving the composition from the get-go, and then I just had to find a suitable foreground. And so this is almost like an X marks the spot, right? We've got these really strong diagonal lines coming from the corners with the clouds, and then really strong diagonal lines coming in from the lower corners with the rocks, and they almost create an X within the scene. And then that one shrub just filling that negative space in the foreground, which happens to also be a triangle, if you think about it. And that shape and that tonal contrast of the brighter bits of the shrub created a little bit of that dynamic balance that I was talking about, a little bit of visual mass in that darker negative space in the foreground. All right, another element to think about, and this can be a super useful technique compositionally, is to look for things that create frames, right? That do just what frames do, right? They sort of encapsulate a subject and kind of show the viewer exactly what it is you want them to see. It helps to draw the eye. This is a classic frame. This is Mesa Arch out in Canyonlands, and this is just a beautiful scene. If you've been here before, it can be super crowded and kind of sometimes frustrating to photograph. But if you do get lucky and you get there early and you get the place to yourself, it can be marvelous. But that frame just helps kind of, provide that visual anchor and create that near-far relationship. And, of course, you've got that beautiful warm glow underneath the arch, sun star to create a little bit more visual interest, but then also it just pulls my eye deeper into the canyon to the washerwoman arch, which is out, the one that's out in the distance. And again, very strong backlight. Here's another arch. This is Mobius Arch, framing Lone Pine Peak out in the Sierra Nevada in the Alabama hills. And again, this is another good example of this concept of visual mass, right? Like the arch is darker, it occupies a larger portion of the frame, therefore has a lot of visual mass. But then we've got the mountain in the background, with a little bit of twilight glow on it. Even though it's smaller, it's brighter. And so it has a significant amount of visual mass. And then that tiny little crescent moon in the background as well helps to balance the much darker, larger elements of the arch. Another little arch and sea cave on the Olympic coast. And here, using a slow shutter speed to allowing that water to recede into the distance, creating those nice strong diagonal lines, which all bring the eye right to that sea stack in the midground, which also creates a shape. It's almost like a puzzle piece. And I was very intentional in how I position the camera so that the tip of that sea stack looks like you could, like a key into a lock, into that little notch in the upper portion of the arch. And these are all things that with time you'll start to recognize and see in the field and can make good use of. All right, so looking for repetitions as well. Shapes that repeat can create some tension and dynamism in the image. Things that mimic, like reflections, are great. I've already talked a little bit about trying to find shapes in the foreground that mimic shapes in the sky. Well, there's no better way to mimic shapes in the sky than to find a nice calm pool of water and create a reflection which perfectly mimics the shapes in the sky. With reflections, the key is to get your camera really, really low. So when I was shooting this scene, my camera was literally inches from the surface of the water in order to maximize the amount of the sky that was reflecting in the surface of the water. So, a few inches, certainly a couple of feet, makes a huge difference with reflection. So if you've got something really big or a big, beautiful sky that you want to reflect, get that camera as low and as close to the water as you can. All right, nice foreground here, leading lines, once again, mimicking the shapes in the sky. Once again, nice, wispy diagonal lines in the sky, and then allowing that water to wrap around this foreground boulder, creating almost a perfect mirror of what's going on in the sky. So that's a very, very effective tool. This shot almost got me killed, actually. This is in Iceland, and obviously an iceberg. And it was a very big iceberg, probably the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. So I shot this at, I think, 14 millimeters, maybe even wider. Actually, no, this was 11 millimeters. And I sort of pre-visualized, because I love the radiating shapes, almost like horns coming off of this piece of ice. And I thought, okay, well, if I can get out in the water, I was wearing waders, get out in the water and wait for a wave to come in and wash up underneath this iceberg and then recede out toward me, then I can mimic the shape of the ice in the shape with the shape of the water. And so I set my camera up, I got it all mounted, I pre-focused, and I waded out into the North Atlantic with the waves coming in from behind me like a total moron. And every time the water would come up underneath this piece of ice, it would pitch and roll and make all of these groaning noises. So fortunately, I got the shot in the first couple frames and then got back to dry land before I got killed. It was probably one of the more dangerous things I've ever done. Another example, getting very, very low and very, very close, accentuating, or I guess over exaggerating the size of things. These little wood sorrel plants and ferns are very, very small, but with a wide angle lens, getting very, very close, they appear much, much larger. And that foreground, all those strong diagonal lines and triangles mimic the radiating shapes of the vine maple trunks in the upper half of the frame. All right, another reflection, getting very, very low, using the water to create that nice arcing diagonal line, which leads us out to Mount Kirchhoffel. Getting in the water, if you're shooting streams and waterfalls, I can't recommend enough a good pair of like waders or muck boots or something like that that allow you to actually get in the water. You don't have to go deep into the water, but standing in the water and using the flow as the foreground and getting close. So fill the frame with all that goodness. You know, this is standing probably knee deep in this pool. When water flows, you know, down through a cascade and into a pool, it always sort of radiates out into the pool. And so if you get really close to that with a wide angle lens, you can just accentuate those beautiful lines and create that wonderful foreground element. Long shutter speeds, finding spots in a stream where there's a little bit of an eddy, where the water is kind of rotating back against the current in a sort of calm portion of the stream. And anything that's in that eddy, like foam bubbles, or in the fall, leaves with a long shutter speed, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, something like that, can create these marvelous patterns and concentric circles. Here's another example of that. This is all over in Acadia National Park in Maine. All right, so these extreme wide angle lenses allow you to shoot in places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. So slot canyons are absolutely, you know, I can't imagine trying to shoot in a slot canyon without a super wide angle lens. Here's another, this is out in Canyonlands. I climbed down into this tiny little alcove and was able to use 14mm perspective to kind of accentuate the size of this tiny little cave, which was kind of difficult to get in. But it creates this nice sort of being there feeling. This is definitely at 14mm. Vanishing point, wonderful patterns and textures in the sides of the rocks here. Another example, again, slot canyons. The only lens I bring into a slot canyon is something like a 14-24. All right, so I've already mentioned this a couple of times. Our eyes do not see like this perspective, right? So you need to train your eye and your brain to see the potential of 14mm or 16mm. So you really need to get that lens on and spend time walking around with it and looking through it. All right, our next sort of biggest challenge is determining depth of field, right? So we know, I'm sure that we all know this, that shallow depth of field, you know, is only one plane of the subject or the scene can be in focus at any one time, right? And the rest of the scene, foreground and background, appearing in focus is all a matter of aperture, okay? So it's really up to you how you want to render the world. I mean, just because you're shooting nature and landscapes doesn't mean that everything in the scene has to be tack sharp from front to back. In this particular scene, not a very wide angle view, but I shot it at f16 and f22 to get everything in the background in focus, but it was just too busy and chaotic, and I didn't like it. And it wasn't sort of representing the mood and the feeling I was getting on this particular afternoon in the forest. And so opening the lens up and shooting at f4, f2.8, and letting everything go out of focus gave it that sort of soft, ethereal feel that I was after. And so it's really up to us how we want to render the depth of field. There's no right or wrong. It's really a personal choice and aesthetic, okay? So smaller apertures, f11, f16, f22. If you can avoid using f22, I would, just because you start to get a little diffraction and start losing a little bit of sharpness. But you want to choose your depth of field based on the aesthetic that you want in the scene, in the photograph, right? Do you want near to far sharpness? Oftentimes, you know, for landscape photos, you do, but not always. All right, so now where do we focus? And this kind of gets into, like, if we're using a wide angle lens and we're getting really close to our foreground elements, how do we achieve depth of field if we're getting super close? Because the closer we get to the subject, we might start to, you know, get to a point where there is no focal point, that no place we can focus in the scene and combine it with an aperture and get everything from near to far in sharp focus. So you want to definitely utilize hyperfocal focusing. So you do not want to focus on the closest thing to the camera, okay? You're wasting depth of field if you do that. So you want to focus a little deeper into the frame, choose the aperture, because then you will get half the distance back in focus as well as out, you know, into the background. And so you can use depth of field calculators, and there's definitely a mathematical way to figure out exactly, based on the closeness to the subject, how far into the scene you should focus. But I don't do any of that. I kind of use a quick and dirty little rule of thumb. So what I do is I will set up my shot, my composition, and then I will estimate the distance from the back of the camera, right where the sensor plane is, from that to the closest part of the scene that I want in focus. And let's say that that distance is 2 feet. All right, I don't have a tape measure with me. I'm just estimating. It's 2 feet. Then I will focus out to about 4 feet. That's where I will focus the lens, and then choose the aperture. So usually starting at f11, take a test shot, zoom in, make sure your foreground's nice and sharp, make sure your background's nice and sharp. You may have to adjust the aperture. You may have to make it a little smaller, maybe f16. You may also have to tweak the focal point. You know, if you focused for this shot, I think I focused out sort of almost not quite mid, maybe a third of the way, which is where this other rule of thumb comes in, that you want to focus 1/3 of the way from the bottom of the frame, which is probably in this shot about where I focused, kind of where the triangular shaped rock kind of meets the rounder kind of rock in the midground. That's where I focused. So if you focus there, take a test shot, zoom in. If your foreground corners aren't quite sharp enough at, say, f11 or f16, then maybe pull your focal point back toward the camera a little bit. Take another shot, make sure the background is also in focus, okay? There's nothing worse than getting home and finding out that you missed the depth of field on the shot. So for this shot, I wasn't right on top of these rocks, not super, super close. I think I focused on the rock, the sort of triangle shaped rock in the mid left, right at the tip of it, where it's sort of pointing out into the distance. Here, probably focused mid lupin field, not on the closest flowers, and shot this at f11. So most of the time with a wide angle lens, because with wide angle lenses, you get a little bit more depth of field for your buck, okay? All right. There are a few sort of pitfalls that we have to watch out for when we're using wide angle lenses, especially for photographing buildings or in the forest. When we point up or we point the camera up with a wide angle lens, we can start getting our vertical lines converging, right? Called keystoning. Sometimes it can be compositionally interesting. Other times it can be super annoying. So you just have to really be aware that that's happening. You know, with this particular shot, I did get quite a bit of keystoning, and fortunately now with software, we can correct for a lot of that, okay? Otherwise, you have to invest in some really expensive, tilt shift lenses, which do a great job, but more stuff to carry, more stuff to buy. But when you're in the forest and you're shooting up through a canopy of trees, that convergence can compositionally be very, very interesting, providing a lot of energy and depth to your shots. Here's another example, shooting super, super wide, laying flat on my back, shooting up through this aspen canopy. And again, beautiful blue sky, not a lot of, great, no clouds in the sky really. And then including that sun and making a little bit of a sun star there. All right, the other issue with shooting wide that can kind of come into play is using filters. And if you're using a polarizer on a wide angle lens, make sure that you get the thin mount polarizer, get the thinnest polarizer you can so that you don't get vignetting in the corners. Here on this shot, you can actually see in the upper left and right hand corners quite a bit of vignetting, very darkening corners, not only from the polarizer, but I also had a graduated neutral density filter and holder on the front of the lens too. So you really have to be careful when you're using filters. And also you want to avoid stacking filters, let's say a neutral density filter and a polarizer combined, shooting at 14 millimeters, will probably most definitely give you a little bit of vignetting. All right. So here's that filter holder on a wide angle lens, and it can be kind of problematic. The other problem that you can run into is getting uneven polarization, right? So if you've got a really wide angle of view and you've got a lot of blue sky and you're using a polarizer, it's not going to create an equal amount of polarization across that field of view because you're including so much of the sky. And so you really have to be careful. And oftentimes I don't use a polarizer to darken blue skies anyway. It's much easier to do that in Lightroom just by changing the luminance of the blue channel if you want to create, richer, darker blue skies. I wouldn't do that with a polarizer, especially out west or at higher altitudes. You can really get some kind of unnaturally dark looking skies. And then the other kind of challenging thing with many of today's newer ultra wide angle lenses, this is the Canon 11-24, the Nikon 14-24, the original one, they have this bulbous front element with an integrated lens hood. So you can't use screw-on filters. And so it makes it very challenging and very expensive because you have to buy these, these large, I mean, they're dinner plate size polarizers, neutral density filters. And there's a whole, contraption holder that goes on the lens, and you have to put the thing on the lens before you mount it. They're just a pain in the neck, and they're very expensive. You'll be spending $500 for a polarizer and the contraption. So fortunately, I've noticed, especially with Nikon, with the new Z series, they make a great 14 to 30 millimeter lens that accepts 82 millimeter standard filters, so you don't have to buy these things. So hopefully we can start moving away from these bulbous front element wide angle lenses. All right, now one big question that comes up, and this has to do with depth of field, and when you're getting super, super close to your foreground subjects, you may not be able to achieve depth of field with aperture and hyperfocal focus alone. Okay. And so you may need to do what's called focus stacking. And so when you do this, you have to use a tripod. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be kind of taking, it's like bracketing, but for focus, right? So you're going to take multiple frames where you adjust the focus from near to far. I like to use as few frames as I possibly can get away with. So in this shot, I couldn't get everything from front to back in focus, so I needed to focus stack. So, all right, here's another example. Getting super, super close to the foreground to really create this dynamic foreground of radiating lines. So my camera's inches away from these ripples in the mud, and so there's no way that I could focus, say, on the reflection and stop down to even f/22 and get it all in focus. So how do we go about doing this? All right, well, so I did this in 4 shots, and you can see the different focus points for each one. And what I would recommend doing is shooting all of the frames at like a medium aperture, something like f8 or f11. Because then each of the frames will have a little bit of depth of field inherent to it around the focal point. Okay, so you won't need as many to cover that range of front, near to far. Okay, and they're nice sharp apertures as well. So I could get away with 4 different frames. So one very, very close, near corner, a little deeper for focus point 2. Focus point 3 was out on the rocks in the tide pool, and then the last focal point was at the sea stack. And then now those frames you can use to combine in Photoshop or another program, something like Helicon Focus or something else. You cannot combine them in Lightroom, unfortunately, maybe someday. But there are lots of tutorials about how to do that online. But it can make or break the shot, right? I mean, if you want this extreme angle of view and you're super, super close to your foreground, you may need to focus stack. Now, it's not as necessary as you think. And if you're not super proficient, say with, merging files in Photoshop yet, then maybe just adjust your composition a little bit, maybe back up a little bit, and use that hyperfocal focus technique. So here's the last one. This was extreme close vantage point on this foreground to really accentuate the shapes in the foreground, that cracked mud tiles, that repeating pattern with the mountains in the background. And so focused in probably 4 different spots here, and then combined those in Photoshop. There was another technique that some people are using called perspective blending, where when you go super, super wide and your mountains in the background get really, really small. I don't personally do this because to me, I don't know, it's not really photography anymore. If that's what you're doing. But so you're taking multiple frames where you've got a really wide angle foreground, and then you zoom in for the mountains in the background, and then you combine those. And there's not a super easy way. It's not as easy as, using the align and blend functions in Photoshop. You have to be pretty proficient about, using layers and masks and potentially warping different things and making sure different things, or all the elements within the scene kind of line up. So it's not something that I do personally, but I will show you a quick technique as we're wrapping up here that you can use in Lightroom to kind of make your mountains, if they got a little small, pop them up a little bit. All right. But my final message as far as being out in the field and shooting is never forget the immortal words of Wayne Gretzky: you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So experimentation is key. And of course, having fun with it. So let me just show you real quick. I'm going to pull up Lightroom. I know I probably went over a little bit here, but I want to show you. All right. So this image, this is a wide angle shot. This is from out in Death Valley last year. And we can see that, by shooting wide, the mountains, they're not tiny, but they're not quite as impressive as maybe they could be. Okay. So one thing that you can consider doing is in Lightroom, underneath the transform tool, okay, you've got a bunch of different sliders that allow you to play around with different elements, perspective elements.
Kurt,
Yeah. Yes.
We don't see your Lightroom. We're looking
You
at
don't?
No, we don't see Lightroom.
You're kidding. Oh no. What do you see?
I see your slideshow of your keynote, the slides.
Oh wait. All right. Hold on a sec. How about now?
No.
Oh no.
Can you minimize the keynote?
I did. Oh, you know what? I might have to stop and then restart the screen share. Oh, wait a minute. You know what? For some reason, the screen share is paused. All right, let me just quick stop it and then restart it. Here we go. Thanks for telling me that, Joe. All right,
Perfect.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
All right, awesome. All right, so in Lightroom, all right, so here's the image, shot wide. Mountains aren't super small, but we could make them stand up a little bit taller. Okay, so within the transform tools in the develop module in Lightroom, we've got a number of sliders down here: vertical, horizontal, rotate, aspect, scale, which allow us to kind of make some changes to elements of the perspective. So one thing that I might consider doing is with the vertical slider, and you can use this as well if you're shooting like buildings or whatever, and you're getting some of that keystoning. So I'm going to use the vertical slider, and basically as you go back and forth with this, you're just tipping the image front and back. So I'm just going to stand those mountains up a little taller. All right. So here it is before and after. I haven't changed the composition much. I'll show you how to get rid of this white canvas that shows up around the image in just a second. The other tool, the aspect slider, we can use to kind of scrunch or stretch the image horizontally. So if I grab this aspect slider and I drag it to the right, I'm kind of compressing the image, almost like squeezing it, which gives the effect of the mountains kind of bulging upward, right? So they're standing up a little bit taller. If I go the other way, I can stretch them out and make them less tall, which is not what I want to do. So I'm just going to squeeze them a little bit taller. And then from here, you can either crop to get rid of the white on either side of the frame that's appeared, or you can use the scale slider to just rescale the image. And now I've gotten a little close to the top of the frame with the mountain. So here's where you can play around with your XY offset. And so let me just drop the foreground down a little bit there. And so here it is before and after. I still have essentially the same composition, but now my mountains, if they were a really prominent and important part of the story I was trying to tell, that's one way in Lightroom that we can use. So the vertical and aspect sliders can help you kind of restore some of what you lose in the background when you're shooting very wide. All right. That is enough of me. I know I went a little over. I apologize, but I'm happy
is-
to answer any questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share.
Okay. A couple questions, Kurt.
Yeah.
Do you ever use wide angle when you're photographing people?
Usually not, unless it's like an action kind of oriented kind of a thing. Like I used to shoot a bunch of skiing, and mountain biking and stuff like that. So I would use my wide angle a lot of times then to get that kind of interesting perspective of somebody kind of blasting by the camera, but not really so much for portraits. Having said that, certainly there's times where you might want to. The danger is, though, when you're shooting really wide and you get close, you can get distortion, right? And so you can kind of, make for unflattering portraits that way. But if I can certainly think of instances where if somebody's doing something, right, like somebody's a crafter or something like that, and is making something, and whatever it is that they're using, the tools and the fabric and the hands are a big part of the story, then maybe getting in close with a wide angle certainly might work. But you got to kind of be careful with the distortion that you might get on facial features and things like that, and maybe gets a little less flattering.
Okay. Bill asked a question about why you use the slow shutter speeds on moving water.
Because I want to create a little bit of a blur rather than freezing the motion, which to me kind of doesn't look, the blur looks unnatural, obviously, but water that's moving and is stopped, that doesn't look natural to me either. But the blur helps to create those nice, long, elegant, silky lines, which wouldn't appear otherwise. And so for me, it's just a way of adding, some more visual interest and creating lines, foregrounds especially, that aid with the visual flow.
Okay. When you walk into a scene, what would be your default f-stop typically when using wide angle? What do you
so for I would say, okay, so for, let's say, like a traditional kind of wide angle image where you've got foreground, midground, background, like a lot of what we saw, and I want everything to be sharp from front to back, and I'm not right on top of it so close that I have to focus stack. If you're shooting at 14, 16 millimeters, most of the time you should be able to get away with f11 to f16.
Okay, like the shot that's behind you, that would be a typical, be your print on the wall. That would be something.
That's easily f11.
F11.
Yeah,
Okay.
easily.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say I bet of all the wide angle images that we saw in the presentation tonight, I bet 80% of them, if I did a search in Lightroom, if I filtered in Lightroom for aperture, I bet 80% of those images were f11.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else have a question for Kurt? Just unmute yourself and you can ask them.
I know, Kurt, this is Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Hi. On your first slide of the presentation were the clouds. Now, Joe's not going to like this, but I have a thing that I see faces. I saw a couple in your clouds.
Okay.
But on the first one, the very first title page, on the right-hand side, the way the clouds are positioned, it almost looks like a creature
Oh,
standing and bending forward.
I love it. I'll have to
You
go
have
back
to
and
look at it a little bit before you see it, but I
All
saw
right.
it right off the bat. It was neat.
All right, I love it.
Your photos are fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I, like you, I love seeing things in the clouds too. So
All right.
Okay, there, Terry. Anybody else have a question for Kurt? Well, Kurt, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. We had 43 people on the
cool.
the presentation tonight. I want to thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute themselves, and we want to give you an applause because this was just a fascinating presentation tonight. So we thank you so much. Everybody, we can clap.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very
much.
good. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you much. We're going to stop the recording now and take care.
All right. Take care, Joe. Safe travels, everyone. And I wish you
Good
the
night.
best in light. I wish you the best in light.
Okay,
you.
thank you much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.